Good afternoon, or good morning for me. I'll be recording this talk, and if you just bear with me, I shall start my screen share and then start the PowerPoint presentation. So the talk is about the rise and fall of the British School of Intonation. I want to give a history of the evolution of what's called the British School, and it's only called that because of where it was developed. And I'm going to argue that it's a truly phonological model, even if, as the history will show, it only became that gradually. And then I'll compare and contrast briefly between the British school and the currently dominant autosegmental metrical framework. So what are the typical characteristics of a British school analysis in, say, the middle of the 20th century? If you take an utterance like this, there's no need to interfere with it. Then you can see that there's a phonetic representation, an impressionistic representation, rather like a musical stave, but without the lines, and dots for each syllable, and some distinction between stressed syllables, here the black dots, and unstressed syllables. At the top, you've got what are sometimes called tonetic stress marks. They're iconic symbols indicating pitch movements. So fear with it. At the end there is a fall rise. No need to enter is a downward glide indicated by the downward arrow here. And the British School gave an explicit structure to the intonational phrase. I'll talk about intonational phrases because that's the current term, though in the 20th century there are various terms such as breath group and tone unit. So at the end there was the nucleus, often described as nucleus plus tail, so there's some difference as to whether the nucleus is just the final accented syllable or the syllables which follow it, which otherwise are called the tail. A head, which stretches from the first accented syllable up to, but not including the nucleus. And then in the later stages, the pre-head was identified for any unaccented syllables at the beginning of the utterance. So this is the kind of analysis that we'll be heading towards as we look at the history. We also need to ask what defines the term phonological. So Bob Ladd said a phonological analysis has a relatively small number of categorically distinct elements mapping to a physical description of the utterance. And he described the British school as proto-phonological because the physical description is impressionistic, not quantitative. I would argue that's a slightly anachronistic perspective, because if it wasn't possible, as it wasn't, to do acoustic analysis on any scale, then an impressionistic analysis, an auditory analysis, is the best substitute. We could also say, if you think about segmental phonology, there is a variable relation between a category and meaning. So a phoneme, in segmental terms, the phoneme k has no meaning, and a variable relation to realization. So one of the first things you learn about phonemes is that they have variable allophones. They have allophones. So a velar stop can be more front, more back, can be rounded, often depending on the quality of the vowel that's following it. A phonological analysis must have a conception of structure, for instance, syllable structure. And it will also have phonotactics, so rules of co-occurrence. So for instance, the fact that in English you can have a syllable beginning tr, tr, but not tl, tl. And as I'll show, all these characteristics emerge in the British School of Intonation Analysis. If you look back, there are mentions of intonation quite early on, usually to do with punctuation and maybe how to pronounce text. In the 17th century, Butler says, the question mark raiseth the common tone or tenor of the voice in the last word. But if it, the question, begin with a word interrogative, as who, what, how, where, why, etc., it falleth as a period. So he has actually cottoned on to what not all commentators realize, which is that not all questions rise. They don't have to rise, and particularly WH questions usually don't rise in English. And then we come to Joshua Steele, who was a scholar and a humanitarian interested in anthropology, as we'd call it nowadays. And he had a bit of a fight, a bit of a gentlemanly disagreement with James Burnet, also known as Lord Monboddo, who is another intellectual. He was a lawyer. Sorry, it's James Burnet, who's the anthropologist. Anyway, James Burnet got under the skin of Joshua Steele by saying, English has accents, but there is no change of tone in them. It's merely like the beating of a drum. And Joshua Steele thought, no, I don't agree with that. I think there is a tune, a tone, a pitch movement in English. And so he set about judging his own intonation to the nearest quarter tone, so half a semitone, using his bass viol, which is, I think, similar in size to a modern cello. And he stuck a piece of paper on the neck of his bass viol, divided it up by ear into quarter tones, and then used that, then judged his own intonation against notes that he played using that scale as a template, or using that template as a way of judging the pitch intervals. And he came up with this amazing notation. It's clearly musical in nature. So it has syllables represented by musical notes of different size. So minims, quavers, semiquavers, I think. And then in the stave itself, between the lines, the black curving or straight line indicates what he perceived as pitch movement within each syllable. He also dealt with, I think he called it emphasis, what we might think of as rhythm. So he notated syllables as heavy, light, or even lighter, the two dots. And he had, as in musical notation, things like crescendo, decrescendo, quiet bits, louder bits. So he's doing many different sorts of analysis at the same time. And I think it's an incredibly impressive intellectual exercise, this, quite original. So what happened? Joshua Steele shared his analysis both in correspondence with James Burnet and then published it as a book in 1775. And James Burnet conceded most graciously. He said, yeah, I'm convinced you're right. A model of an academic debate where one side actually concedes that new analysis means they were wrong. So Steele's analysis is largely pre-phonological. He doesn't have a set inventory of tonal categories. So if you think back to the tadpole diagram that I showed you on the first page, on the second slide or so, Steele's analysis is more like the impressionistic tadpoles and dots and so on than the tonetic stress marks. But I think it has a prosodic scope unmatched until Crystal's prosodic systems and intonation in English. Deals with so many different aspects, including the dynamics of speech production. Moving on quite a long way to the late 19th century, Henry Sweet, who was a major dialectologist and phonetician, has some observations on stress and intonation, though without claiming any particular skill in that area. One interesting thing which is relevant, but a little bit of a diversion, he says it's sufficient to recognize 3 degrees of stress, while in reality, the variations of stress are infinite. So he gives examples like this: impenetrability, where the B or the bill is the primary stress, the most stressed element. And this notion of not all these levels being audibly distinct, but there being in effect an infinity of levels of prominence or stress. Actually, for those of you who know Chomsky and Haller's sound pattern of English from 1968, their stress cycle has a very similar result. So there are many, many levels of stress in an utterance. When it comes to intonation, he has notations like this. So this presumably sounded something like, "Do you object to tobacco smoke?" "Not at all." So he has at the end an iconic symbol which indicates a particular tone, in this case a fall, and then a rise after tobacco smoke. He talks about pitch range. He has high and low variants of the tones. But he associates these pitch patterns with the breath group or the intonational phrase, and doesn't really associate them with the accented, the prominent syllables in the way that we would today. He also divides the utterance up in his phonetic transcription into feet separated by spaces, and he marks secondary stresses. So he's moving towards a kind of tonetic stress marking, like the fall rise that you saw in the first example I gave you, but it's still quite a long way from the kind of analysis that was common in the latter part of the 20th century, second half of the 20th century. So he provides a tonal inventory, quite like the 20th century ones. He doesn't explicitly associate the pitch movements to prominences, even though he does recognize rhythmic grouping. And he doesn't talk about any structure within the breath group, except for rhythmic structure. So let's summarize what we've got so far. Butler recognizes that a particular intonational category, a rise versus a fall, doesn't correspond exactly to meaning. It's not that a rise must mean a question. And he doesn't really give much phonetic description. Steele gives a very, very detailed phonetic description, an impressionistic description. And he also talks about, sorry, there should be little boxes coming up here. He also talks about voice dynamics. And then Sweet adds a sense of there being categories, intonational categories. So he has, I think, six categories, and makes clear that the category is not invariant. There are different realizations of a category. And he also, by putting his tonal mark at the end of the utterance after the breath group, is kind of moving towards the notion of the nucleus. He's saying that something's happening near the end, which is important for the intonation. I think the person who really laid the foundation for the kind of analysis that was common in the 50s and 60s and 70s was Harold Palmer, not Frank Palmer you might have come across as a grammarian, but this is a different Palmer. So he wrote a book which is really pedagogical. It's for teaching intonation. And he gives an explicit structure to the intonational phrase. So he uses the term head, nucleus, tail, which I previewed on the first graphic that I showed you. He has an inventory, a list of nuclear tones. He has an inventory of head patterns, pitch patterns for the head, smaller than the list of nuclear tones, but he does allow the head patterns to repeat themselves or to reduplicate. He has the insight that patterns start on accented syllables, and he uses the term tail, as I tried to describe it at the beginning, for any unaccented syllables after the nucleus. And he talks about pitch range. So this is Palmer's inventory of nuclear tones. So falling, high rising, falling rising, and low rising. And he recognizes intensified variants of the fall and the fall rise, and actually says that the non-intensified fall is the, if you like, the unmarked term, the less meaningful variant, but that the intensified, the one with, here we are, I hope you can see the arrow, the little kick up in pitch in the nuclear syllable, that is the default or the unmarked term for the fall rise. This is very like the kind of inventory you'd get in the mid-20th century. And he had notations like this. So this utterance is presumably something like, "What a remarkably pretty little house. What a remarkably pretty little house." So he's using straight lines, not dots, except for the dynamic pitch movement of the nucleus. And so this would be a falling nucleus. All the stuff before is a head, and it's what he called a scandant head. Scandant just means climbing, a climbing head, and it's broken, or what I would prefer to call reduplicated. So it's 3 successive repeated rising patterns, each note beginning on an accented syllable. This is, we're now getting quite near to what I showed you at the beginning. So his analysis is more phonological than previous work. He's got an internal structure to the intonational phrase. He is quite concerned whether choices are significant, because phonological choices should be usable to signify something different, to make a contrast. He talks about even co-occurrence restrictions. Like, remember I said you can have TR at the beginning of an English syllable, you can't have TL. He says things like, "It is doubtful whether the low rising nucleus is ever preceded by an inferior head." So he's got co-occurrence restrictions between head and nucleus. And he dissociates the nucleus from being the greatest prominence. So he says the balance of prominence depends on the patterns. And this is something which he was right about, in my view, and many people who followed him were not right, because they would say, well, the nucleus is the most prominent syllable in the utterance. If you want me to ask me about that, I can give you examples of that, but it's simply not true. The nucleus is the last accent within the intonational phrase. It may not sound the most salient. Then Roger Kingdon, his book, The Groundwork of English Intonation, builds on Palmer. He has a similar sort of structure. So he has the nucleus. I'm using Palmer's example, but translated into the kind of interlinear graph that Kingdon uses. So nucleus at the end, tail, this example, there aren't any unaccented syllables after the nucleus, so the tail is empty, the nucleus is low falling. And then he actually makes the distinction between head being the accented syllable at the beginning of that pre-nuclear part and the body. And that's kind of an unnecessary complication, I think. Sorry. But it's mirroring the split between nucleus and tail in some sense. And then he also introduces the term pre-head. So those unstressed, unaccented syllables before the first accent, "What a remarkably pretty little house." If they're unaccented, then they come into a category of their own, part of the intonational phrase, namely the pre-head. And here he would call it an ascending prehead. So Kingdon's analysis is very analytic. It's very phonetically elaborate. So for instance, there are 5 kinetic tones or glides, and they can occur high and low, and they can occur normal and emphatic. So you can see it's getting pretty complicated. And maybe you could say he loses sight of the wood for the trees, loses sight of the phonological wood, the sort of part of intonation or the way that intonation is relatable to meaning, and gets too interested in the phonetic detail, even though he explicitly aims to provide the essential elements of intonation described separately and then assembled into tunes. I think as a learner of English, it must have been quite a daunting book to get your head around. However, the detail and the insights in his analysis make the book a landmark in the tradition that I'm talking about. Then O'Connor and Arnold, some of you may have even may have used this book in your learning of English or learning of English phonetics. The Intonation of Colloquial English came in 2 editions, and it combines elements of Palmer and of Kingdon, and in a pedagogically more accessible package. They talk about contrasts at prehead, head, and nucleus. They talk about the tail, but they don't offer any ways in which the tail can be contrastive. They have functionally equivalent combinations of elements gathered into tone groups. So for instance, for a particular nucleus, the presence or absence of optional elements before the nucleus allow those usually longer or shorter utterances to be grouped functionally into the 8 or so tone groups that they talk about. And they're concerned with phonotactics, so this, I think, makes it phonological. So they, in the first edition anyway, they give a table like this, 10 tone groups down the left, inventories at the top for the nuclear tone, 6 possibilities, 4 possibilities for the head, 2 for the prehead. Where you get a dot, it means that having that element is optional, so it may not be there. And I know it's a daunting table to take in at one go, but if you look down here, if the nucleus is a fall rise with or without a tail, so a dot in the tail column, what can you do before that? Well, you can do nothing because everything in the earlier columns is a dot. But if you're going to do something, you can have a sliding head or a high fall head. So the last 2 columns of the head part, but not a low head or a stepping head. So this is a phonotactic restriction on elements within the intonational phrase. And their pedagogical description follows these restrictions. I think it's not necessarily a statement that you absolutely cannot have, you will never hear other combinations, but I think they're trying to reduce the possibilities to a manageable number that learners of English can learn. We can discuss whether that's a realistic goal, but that's what they were trying to do. So if we go back to our table, we're now on Palmer. He makes explicit the association of intonational elements to stress. So it's the stress syllables that begin a pitch movement. And he gives the explicit structure to the intonational phrase, the nucleus and the head, not yet the prehead. And he talks a little bit about phonotactics. Kingdon adds the prehead, and O'Connor and Arnold take on all those aspects, really. Other people you might have heard of other contributors to intonation. So, well, you'll have heard probably of Daniel Jones, who was one of the leading lights of English phonetics in the first half of the 20th century. Now, he did some early work making very impressionistic records of pitch contours. And he did this actually by using a phonograph, an early gramophone, and lifting the needle after each bit that he wanted to transcribe. And he came up with these very impressionistic attempts to record the pitch movement in an utterance. This is, if I can produce it, it's not an easy thing to read, but I suppose I can buy stamps there. The last bit, stamps there. You can see it's a full rise at the end. It's a question on a full rise. Later on, he abandoned that and adopted a system promoted by Armstrong and Ward, which is basically a two-tune analysis, a rise and a fall. And I think that method didn't really contribute to the development. In fact, it was a backward step in many ways. Little structural or phonological analysis. Halliday, you may have heard of. His analysis was broadly within the British tradition, but he was particularly concerned with relating intonation to grammar. And much more recently, John Wells published a book, English Intonation and Introduction, which does what it says on the label, as it were. So it's an update on the pedagogical tradition, and he draws on Halliday for some of the terminology, which maybe wasn't a good idea, and on O'Connor and Arnold. So anybody who was brought up in the O'Connor and Arnold tradition would quite easily recognize what's going on in the analyses and the examples that he uses. Crystal is different. David Crystal's prosodic systems and intonation in English is an empirical analysis of intonation based on auditory analysis of recorded speakers of RP, received pronunciation British English. And he kind of takes up the baton from Steele. He includes voice dynamics, aspects of paralinguistic prosody, tonal subordination, which you might use for parenthetical items, lowering the pitch in the parenthesis, in the words that are in the parenthesis. many aspects of intonation. And I think it really represents the peak of this tradition as far as research is concerned. It's not a pedagogical work. It's not something you'd pick up if you wanted to improve your English intonation as a non-native speaker, unless you were very ambitious. But it contains a huge number of insights into the use of intonation, the use of intonation in RP. So, the story so far. By the middle of the 20th century, 1950, 1960, the British school provides an inventory of categorically distinct elements, as a phonology should, a mapping to phonetic realizations, a phonetic description, admittedly auditory, admittedly impressionistic. It recognizes certainly a variable relationship between a category and meaning. So it's not that there's one meaning that you associate with a rise. A full rise isn't used for just one purpose. And it recognizes that the shape of a full rise, for instance, will be realized differently, depending often on how many syllables there are. So in the word, if you put a full rise on the word to, all the fall and all the rise happen at the in the one syllable that's available. If you have something like to, you mean, then the rise is delayed until the last syllable. There are some authors recognize an internal structure to the intonational phrase. In fact, almost everybody does by that stage, by the middle of the 20th century. And some people talk about what you can put with what. So what head patterns are acceptable or common with what nuclei, nuclear patterns. So I would say it's a fully phonological framework for intonation. So that's the rise. What about the fall of the British school? Well, in the last quarter of the 20th century, it became largely supplanted, at least for research, by autosegmental metrical models, using not pitch glides, rises and falls, but pitch targets, high and low, sometimes mid, but usually not. Not just auditory analysis, but measurement, mostly on computers, because it was possible. Not that the auditory analysis went out the window, because most of the analysis within AM actually depends very heavily on the kind of auditory judgment of things that was used up to that point. And let's have a look at what's shared and what's not between the British way of doing things, British in inverted commas, and the autosegmental metrical model. So British on the left, AM, autosegmental metrical on the right. So they're both phonological intent, I would say. The intonational phrase is the domain within which analysis takes place. It's the thing that's sometimes called a tone unit in earlier writing. Pitch patterns are associated with prominent syllables. They're kind of hung on to metrically prominent syllables. Information, meaningful information, is concentrated more towards the end of the intonational phrase. Most contrasts are expressible in both systems, though not all. And then we come to the differences. So the British school, as you've seen, deals with pitch movements, AM with H and L targets. British school likes the nucleus, AM doesn't, although it sometimes talks about the nucleus nonetheless. They would say that the nucleus is simply the last pitch accent in combination with a boundary tone. And boundary tones are something which don't figure. This is a pitch designation associated with the end of the intonational phrase. They don't figure at all in the British tradition. British school only allows left-headed accents, meaning that the pitch pattern starts on the accented syllable, whereas AM allows left or right-headed accents. British school usually only allowed one level of phrasing, so a unit called the tone unit or the intonational phrase. The AM quite early on introduced at least two levels, so IP for intonational phrase, small IP, not ideal terminology, but small IP for intermediate phrase. British school did its realization by example, whereas the AM framework in the age of speech synthesis, as well as computer speech analysis, was concerned to try to do intonational realization by rule. British school, mainly pedagogical in purpose, and AM not so much, more to do with research into intonation, speech technology, and that kind of thing. And as I've said before, because of its place in history relative to the development of computer-based speech analysis, the British school relied heavily on impressionistic analysis, whereas AM could add quantitative acoustic analysis, so you can actually measure which of two syllables is higher, or see whether the fundamental frequency is going up or down on a particular syllable. We in Cambridge developed a compromise system in connection with a project called Intonational Variation in English, which looked at intonation in about 8 different cities within the British Isles, including the Republic of Ireland. And the intonation system that we used was also called Ivy, or is now usually called Ivy by connection with the project. And it is autosegmental metrical. It is AM. It uses H and L, and it uses boundary tones. But it uses only left-headed pitch accents, at least in the original version that went with the project. It did allow unspecified boundary tones, which is not allowed in orthodox AM. So we said if there's no pitch movement happening at the boundary, we're not going to mark a pitch target. And it was deliberately more compatible with British analyses than orthodox autosegmental metrical is or was. So this big divide, do you need to use targets or glides? People working in AM think that they've proved that they're right. So various papers involving Bob Ladd and other authors listed there do this. They say, what happens if we can experimentally manipulate the duration of a syllable which has a rise on it? This original work was done on Greek. And so very, very roughly, this is what they found, that if you could, by design, have a longer vowel, the slope becomes less steep. And they interpreted that as meaning that there's an L anchored at the beginning of the first vowel and an H at the beginning of the second vowel. And so what really matters is those L's and H's and where they're stuck onto the segments, rather than the slope. The slope is merely an interpolation between those crucial pitch targets. Yeah, that's probably right, but it's a surface argument. We should also consider whether, from the point of view of perception, is change dominant rather than targets or turning points. It's pretty common in perception that you notice things when they move and not when they're stationary. So we are very interested in movement. And quite separately, the question whether, if you're teaching intonation, it's easier to acquire particular patterns by thinking about targets or by thinking about the movements that join those targets. So glides may actually be easier to imitate. And one possibility is that, in fact, rises and falls are the basic units, but they would be like morphemes, and they could have features. They are realized by features such as H and L, which themselves have to be anchored in the way that I showed you in the previous diagram. So that's a very superficial treatment of that particular issue, but it's not, I think, a closed issue. So as it says, the case for H and L may not be indisputable. It's quite possible to imagine a system that would combine some elements of the British tradition and some of AM. In a sense, Ivy did this. So Ivy took boundary tones. Boundary tones are probably right. There are arguments, good arguments for boundary tones. There are good arguments for more than one level of phrasing. And in fact, my own PhD supervisor wrote a paper on major and minor tone units, fully within the British tradition, but arguing, as I'll show you in an example in a minute, arguing that we need more than the simple notion of a tone unit or intonational phrase. That's coming up. And well, perhaps even in Ivy, we need to recognize right-headed pitch accents. So here we are. Here's something that looks very like the graphic that I showed you very near the beginning. So this utterance, this made-up utterance is, I'm not sure they're really water buffalo. I'm not sure they're really water buffalo. And that traditionally would have a full rise beginning on the primary stress of water buffalo. And the problem with that is that the rise, as I mentioned at one point earlier, doesn't happen until the very end. It's not water buffalo. I did hear a synthesizer early on in the synthesis of intonation trying to do that. It doesn't work. It's water buffalo. So this combines these tonetic stress marks that you saw at the beginning with a special boundary tone. This first line with the arrow means there is a rise at the boundary. So it would be quite easy to introduce boundary tones into a British school analysis. So yes, the boundary tone makes the distribution of pitch more transparent than does the classic fall-rise nucleus. So this is, I slightly in error anticipated this. John Trim, my PhD supervisor, suggested this in 1959 in the article listed there in Le Maître Phonétique, which you might think easy to read if you know French. Well, actually not, because it's all in phonetic transcription. Just to give you one anecdote, I suggested this article to some speech engineers I was working with, and their faces dropped when they realized they were having to plow through several pages of phonetic transcription. But anyway, so John Trim uses examples like this, contrastive examples. I'd very much like to, but father won't hear of it. So he's saying each of these, the whole thing is intonationally coherent, but it's divided in such a way because of the contrast. I'd very much like to, but father won't hear of it. That you really need to have nuclear tones, several of them in the utterance. So he suggests simply having a major tone unit and then a subordinate minor tone unit, smaller in size. So this gives you something very like the AM solution of big IP and little IP, which I mentioned earlier. So that could be translated also using two sorts of boundary tone and getting rid of complex nuclei like fall rises. So it's exactly the same utterance, except that the rising part of the fall rise is treated as a boundary tone. And again, that would have advantages if the material, the nuclear material, were several syllables rather than one or perhaps two syllables in this example. And what about right-headed accents? AM can deal rather elegantly with this kind of utterance. He didn't have a clue. He didn't have a clue. It's really very clearly the same pattern reduplicated. Now, AM does this very neatly. You have H plus L star. Star means this is the prominent syllable. Prominent syllable is the second element. The first element is H, and it's associated with a non-prominent syllable. So with the unstressed he or the unstressed Lots of stuff going on at the end there, the L's, but that's just one of the ways in which classic AM is a bit clunky. It's not really very efficient in my view. If we try and do that in Ivy with its, oh yes, early fall pitch accent, right. In Ivy, it's rather messier. You lose that sense that it's the same pattern happening twice. So you have to have an initial boundary tone, and then you have an L star with a displaced high pitch. And of course, it's a bit vague as to how far that displacement should be. And then an L star, and then no boundary tone. The final bit, the no boundary tone, is good, but the rest of it's not perfect. So it may be that a system that tries to merge or get the best out of both these worlds, the British and the AM world, would have to allow of right-headed patterns. And that would be a big step away from what I think is universal within the British tradition. So, the conclusion. The British framework, and I stress the fact that it's called that because that's where most of the early work was done, it evolved into a model of quite some descriptive power and phonological insight. So it's not just describing patterns, it's talking about the linguistic structure of intonation as well as the patterns themselves. It's still used, it still has currency, and maybe it's better for teaching intonation. Now, how much you actually need to teach intonation, or whether that's the most profitable thing to be teaching learners of a language, is something that we could debate. But if you want to teach intonation, it may be quite a good way of teaching people a framework within which to hear intonation. Because unless you have some sort of framework to help you get a handle on intonation, intonation is genuinely very difficult to hear. You may be good at imitating it, you may not be, but actually to get any kind of analytic handle on it, you need a framework of some sort. The British system is not set in stone, although it appears to be, simply because so little work has been done on it since the dominance of AM. It can, I think, be revised to incorporate those parts of AM which give good insight into intonation. And the Ivy system is already one hybrid. It's autosegmental, but it incorporates concepts. In fact, it's a translation of the British system into AM to quite a large extent. And that's what I have to say. Thank you very much for listening.